Here we are, Greek 2, all new stuff. Are you ready for this? I'm so excited. I'm so excited. I'm so scared. Don't worry, it's not going to be that bad. We're continuing with verbs. As we ended last term in Greek 1, we're still working on the indicative mood of verbs. Remember, the indicative is the mood of fact. It indicates an action that occurs in the mode of reality or in the mode of fact. And we're continuing with the aorist. We ended with the second aorist, and now we move backward to the first aorist. Just two key terms. You can handle that. First aorist and liquid aorist. Let's review the past tense in English once again. We can do the past tense in continuous aspect. This would be formed by adding was or were. We can also do a completed past action, which is typically formed by adding ed to the end of the word, but in irregular verbs, we will alter the root, bring to brought, and so on. So typically in a regular verb, study in the present, studied in the completed past. Eat in the present, ate in the past. Bring in the present, the past. So how about Greek? Well, we have the imperfect tense, which describes a continuous action occurring in the past, and the aorist tense, which describes a completed, also known as an undefined action occurring in the past. So what's the difference? Let's review the helping verbs we use to translate each of the Greek tenses. The present we use is am or are. Future is will. The imperfect uses was or were, whereas the aorist typically uses ed. So remember these helping verbs or suffixes that are used to translate each of the Greek tenses. That's an easy way to summarize what we've done so far. So another way of putting it, the imperfect continuous action, I was loving, or I was saying, as opposed to the aorist, I loved, an action that occurred in the past, but not necessarily a continuous action. Or I said, occurred in the past, but not necessarily a continuous action. So agapesa, I loved, is a first aorist in Greek, whereas apon, I said, is a second aorist. You've learned the second aorist, but what we want to do in this chapter is look at the formation of the first aorist. Now, there's no better way to teach the difference between the imperfect and the aorist than to appeal to the great grammarian Taylor Swift. Her song Blank Space, I believe, has a subliminal message that actually illustrates the difference. Listen closely to her song, Blank Space. Check this out. The aorist is completed, the imperfect is continuous, but they're both done in the past time. I Love Greek can't get enough. I think that there's a layer, a subtext underneath that external layer of blank space where these are actually the words uttered. The aorist is completed, imperfect is continuous, but they're both done in the past time. I Love Greek can't get enough. Got a long list of Greek tenses, they'll tell you I'm insane. Well, you get the idea. That's the difference. The aorist is completed, the imperfect is continuous, but they're both past tense or past time verbs. Now, how do we form this bad boy? Well, you remember the concept of principal parts. The first principal part is the present active indicative, first person singular. The second principal part is what? The future active indicative, first person singular. The third principal part happens to be the aorist active indicative, first person singular. So you need to look to the third principal part to get your stem. To form the active, as with the second aorist, we begin with an augment. You get the aorist active tense stem, which you get from the third principal part. And now you need a tense formative. This is a new concept. We didn't use the tense formative with the second aorist, but we will use it here. So look, the rules for the augment are the same. Typically, you're going to add an epsilon to the beginning of the word, particularly if the stem ends in a consonant, as this does here. So remember, E for earlier. Past tenses use an augment. Past tenses happen earlier, so E for earlier. Stem, tense formative. So the first aorist uses a characteristic sigma alpha to indicate that the action is occurring as an aorist, that is in the past and with completed aspect. And now, because we're in the past tense, we use secondary personal endings. So there's your active. For the middle, your augment, you still get your stem from the third principal part. You still use your sigma alpha as your tense formative, but now we use secondary middle passive personal endings. So recall your 4 sets of personal endings. You have your primary active set, your primary middle passive set, mai sai tai, your secondary active set, which we'll use for our aorist active, and your secondary middle passive set, which we'll use for our for our first aorist middle. Now, the reason we're not using this set also for the aorist passive is that the aorist passive will be formed differently from the aorist middle. If you recall, the present middle and passive are formed identically to each other. For the aorist, that's not true. The aorist middle and the aorist passive will differ. We'll come back to the aorist passive later. So our first aorist active indicative luo would look like this. If we divide up our word, there's our augment. Lu is our stem. Sa is our what? Tense formative. And then the rest consists of our secondary active personal endings. Now, something to point out here. We are not using any personal ending in the first person singular. You just have to remember that's what the aorist active likes to do. It doesn't like to use an ending there. And in our third person singular, we have that movable nu. And this causes a change in our tense formative. It's not sa, but se. So we get sa, sa, sen, samen, sata, san. Our first aorist middle, augment, tense stem, tense formative, and the rest is our secondary middle passive personal endings. Only, of course, this is not passive, it's only going to be middle. So main sa ta methis thanta. Main sa ta? What's happened there in the second person singular? Did you figure it out? It should be sa there. What's happened to the sigma? Well, your form would have looked like this. Elusasa. Only you see that sigma there wedged between two vowels. Man, when two vowels see a sigma like that, they fight over it. And when they do, you end up with only an alpha and an omicron. And of course, those will contract, and omega will always result when you have an omega or an omicron with almost any other vowel. So you end up with eluso, which looks very funny for a second singular, but that's what it looks like. A couple other points about formation of the first aorist. The rule for the square of stops will come into play. And of course, you remember the square of stops. You have labials, you have velars, and you have dentals. Well, because the aorist tense formative begins with a sigma, that sigma, when it comes into contact with a stop, will result in certain changes. So blep plus a sigma will give you bleps. Trib plus a sigma will give you trips. K-rook plus a sigma will give you K-rooks, and so on. So remember the square of the stops and what happens when you add a sigma to it. That will come into play with the aorist just as it did for the future, and just as it did for certain third declension words. Second point, when we have a contract verb will lengthen its connecting vowel in the aorist, as we saw also for the future. So agapao is a contract vowel, contract verb of the alpha class. That contract vowel in the aorist will simply lengthen from alpha to eta. Why do we have an eta at the beginning? because an augment, when the word begins with a vowel, will simply lengthen. We need to introduce a maxim for today. Here it is. If you can't chop it, you ain't got it. What do I mean? I mean, you want to be able to account for every letter of a verb. Every letter belongs to a certain part of the word, and every part of the word has a meaning of its own. So we've chopped it. Augment indicates past time. Tense stem indicates the basic meaning of the word. Tense formative, and then finally personal ending, which indicates if it's I, you, he, she, it, we, or they. You should be able to chop it in a very particular spot. And if you can chop it, then you've accurately identified each of the parts of the verb. And if you've identified each of the parts accurately, then you should be able to translate the verb accurately. Here's a first Aorist song, just for your help if you're interested in more help in learning the Aorist. Click on the link there. We've talked about liquids before. We're back to liquids. A liquid consonant is a consonant that is articulated by flowing the air around the tongue. Now, in this case, we're actually using the word liquid a little bit more broadly. Lambda, mu, nu, and rho. Technically, two of these are nasal consonants. So a lambda and a rho are liquids. Mu and nu are nasals. They are articulated by vibrating the air through the nose. But we use this term liquid in this case to refer to all four. So lambda, mu, nu, or rho. If the stem ends in lambda, mu, nu, or rho, it is called a liquid. Okay? A liquid. Liquid, hot, magma. Okay. So here's our paradigm verb for the liquid aorist. Minnow. Why is this a liquid? It has a stem. When you drop the personal ending, the stem ends in a liquid consonant, a nu in this case. So the third principal part's the one we're interested in for the aorist, emena. So you see there, the stem actually differs from the stem in the present and the future. So to form the liquid aorist active, you still need your augment. But now when we get our aorist tense stem, looking to the third principal part, notice that it's different. It's not men, it's main. Another difference here from the regular first aorist is that the tense formative is different. We don't use sa, we use simply alpha. And then we do use, again, our secondary active personal endings. So for the liquid aorist middle, augment, stem from the third principal part, tense formative alpha, but now we use that secondary middle passive set of personal endings. Main sata. Okay, so here's our paradigm for the liquid aorist active indicative of minnow. If we chop it, there's our augment. There's our tense stem. And now we have not sigma alpha as the tense formative, but simply alpha as the tense formative. And then our secondary endings. The ending just happens not to appear in the first person singular of this conjugation. And as in the regular first aorist, that alpha has become an epsilon. So emena, emenas, emenen. For the liquid aorist middle indicative of minnow, should be self-explanatory. We have our augment, our tense stem, our alpha tense formative, and what set of personal endings? Secondary middle passive set of personal endings. Main, sa, ta, methis, that, and ta. Only notice what's missing in the second person singular. Should be what at the end? Sa. What has happened to the sa? That intervocalic sigma has dropped, and the alpha and the omicron have now contracted to omega. Let me give you one additional point about certain second aorist forms. Occasionally, you're going to find a second aorist stem with a first aorist ending. So, for example, apon. See that alpha there? What tense formative is that? That's actually your first aorist liquid tense formative, as in meno. So what should be a simple second aorist using a connecting vowel, omicron, will often be second aorist using a second aorist stem, but then using the liquid tense formative on analogy with a liquid. And that's kind of an anomaly. And in some ways, you can look at it as a grammatical incongruity. Only language has a mind of its own, and it does what it wants to. That's okay. These rules aren't always prescriptive. Sometimes things happen that don't seem to follow the rules, but once they become conventional, they're conventional. And this is something that simply happens. So you see that also with Aelthon. Looks like a liquid tense formative when this is a verb that actually has a second aorist stem, and you ought to have a connecting vowel there. So how do we translate the first aorist? Looking back to the second aorist from the previous chapter. Eleben un tus artus ha Jesus. What does this say? Go through in your head the rules for translating a Greek sentence. Rule number 1, verb first. Rule number 2, respect the endings. Doing that, here's our verb. Why do we look at the verb first? Well, because we're interested in the personal ending and the grammatical information that that personal ending gives us. That's a third person singular ending. Now we know that the subject is he, she, or it. Well, in this case, we happen to have explicitly stated who that he is in the nominative. Subjects are in the nominative where they're indicated explicitly. So the he is ha Jesus, or the Jesus. We can say simply Jesus. So Jesus, second aorist. Second aorist would be a past time action with completed aspect. So Jesus took, therefore, the bread. Or then Jesus took the bread. So how does this second aorist translation differ from a first aorist translation? The answer is not at all. A first aorist is also a past time action with completed aspect. So Petros agrapsetois in Jerusalem. Petros is our subject. It's in the nominative. Looking at the verb, that's a third person singular ending. So Peter wrote. Now, how do you know that this is aorist? That psi there actually is the combination of a pi and the sigma from the tense formative of the aorist. So Peter wrote. Now we have a dative article. What's our keyword for the dative? To. Peter wrote to the people, or the men in Jerusalem. So there you go. Peter wrote. So once again, it's simply past time with completed aspect. No difference in meaning from the second aorist. First liquid aorist active, same thing. It's going to be a past time action with completed aspect. So here's our nominative. Notice that it's plural. Why? In agreement with the third person plural personal ending of the verb. So that's a they ending. Who is the they? It's the evil men. Why men? Because you have a masculine ending. The evil men, there's your augment, there's your stem, and there's your liquid aorist tense formative, so you know it's an aorist. So the evil men killed, now all in the accusative, 7 men and 1 woman. Really evil men. So by this point, we've had a number of different paradigm words. For most of our tenses, we've used luo. For certain present, future, imperfect, and aorist forms. In other cases, we've had to use a different verb for different reasons. For the present middle, we use erchomai, because erchomai is inherently middle, means I come. For the future middle, we use poruomai. Second aorist active, we use lambano. Not luo, because luo doesn't have a second aorist. Lambano does. And for the second aorist middle, genomai. So ideally, you've mastered the paradigms, the conjugations for all of these tenses and moods. And here's your master verb chart. A great summary that Mounts has provided to the formation of each of the tenses and moods that you've learned so far, column by column. All right, so let's finish up with this chapter's vocabulary. Repeat after me. Aperkomai, arkomai, grapho, dia, doxazo, dunamis, keruso, pino. And congrats, you're up over 3/4 of the words in the New Testament. That is quite an accomplishment, truly. Now, as you go on, you're going to want to know not just the meaning of the lexical form. So you have aperkomai is going to mean I depart. Arkomai is going to mean I begin. You're also going to want to be able to recognize that third principal part in aorist active form. So arkomai, I begin. Erxa, what will it mean now in the past as an aorist? Means I ruled. Likewise for grapho, I write. In the aorist, third principal part, I wrote. So as we go on, make sure that you're looking also at the third principal part, that you're able to recognize it and able to tell the difference in translation from the present. Moreover, I'm continuing to put in brackets the root of the verb, and remember how important the root can be. This is chapter 20 stuff, and at the time I stated chapter 20 is at once one of the most helpful, but also one of the most ignored chapters in the book. It seems maybe a little bit tedious, a little bit too much detail, but actually it's incredibly important if you want to understand the principal parts of verbs. Once you understand that we're building off of a common root, and if you understand the rules for the changes of the root, then you will understand what's going on with the principal parts, and they will never look irregular to you. So for arkomai, remember that the root is arch, and there are changes occurring to that root that account for the different principal parts. See you next chapter.